Hello, everybody. My name is Josh, and I will be your host this evening, along with my co-host Tiffany, who you'll meet in a little bit. She's just appeared on screen. We're going to get this show on the road here. So welcome, and thanks for joining us here at Science Talks this evening. For those of you who haven't joined us before, Science Talks is a series of online informal talks where anyone can come and join the latest ideas in science, research and technology. And these talks are followed by Q&As that are designed to engage you, the public, with learning about recent research in science. Before we start this evening and we meet our speaker and go through a few things to start, we'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Stolo First Nation, specifically the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. And we express our gratitude and respect for the honor of living, working, and creating in this territory. So let's, just before we explore the latest ideas in research and science, I'm just gonna ask all of you, if you could please mute your microphone. There'll be an opportunity after our speaker has talked to engage with him in a Q&A, and that can be done through chatting your questions in, and also there's a raise your hand feature. This event, just so you're aware, is being recorded and will be posted and available afterwards. If you want to show your face, we'd love to see it, but if you would like to be hidden, we just ask that you turn off your video for that. So I'll just go on to just talk about our community agreement here. This is a conversation with an expert and not meant to be a debate. We are going to be accepting and welcoming a wide range of questions, and we encourage that participation. We want to also create a safe environment. So we encourage open-mindedness. So thank you for bringing that today. Our program here today will start off with a few introductions and then a talk from our expert who you will meet in just a moment. Again, we'll hit that Q&A, and then at the end, we'll have a conclusion, some thank yous, and we'll do a group photo or screenshot with everybody who wants to be a part of that. So that's what to expect from this evening.
Beautiful. Thanks, Josh. And I just wanted to take a second to appreciate the community that got us started. The City of Abbotsford and the Vancouver Foundation, the Abbotsford Community Foundation through the Responsive Neighborhood Small Grant. As well, we are amazingly supported here at TED Talks, and we could not be more thankful for these special companies. The University of the Fraser Valley, the Abbotsford Tech District, Envision Financial, Connects UFV alumni, as well as TEDx Abbotsford, Abbotsford Community Foundation, City of Abbotsford, Vancouver Foundation. Thank you so much for supporting us. We could not do this without you as well. Today, we will be hearing about Indigenous history and building reconciliation and dismantling settler colonialism. Dr. Carlson holds a Tier 1 research chair in Indigenous and community engaged history. He considers himself first and foremost an ethnohistorian. His scholarship is designed and conducted in partnership with communities and inspires to answer questions that are relevant to those communities. He's interested in both Indigenous history and Indigenous historical consciousness. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Carlson.
Thank you very much.
I'll let you take it from here.
All right, so I will share my screen. There, everybody working? I think that's working. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. And I want to really thank right off the bat, all of the Stalo elders and knowledge keepers who over the past 28 years have been willing to share with me aspects of their personal family history, their Squelquel, and the broader knowledge of the history and territory that I'm so privileged to live in. So thank you very much. And what I'll be doing today is sharing some of that information back with you. The elders that I've worked with have given permission to share aspects of what they've shared with me, and coupling that with work that I've done in the archives and the various libraries. So when I start, oops, hang on. When I start a presentation like this today, I'd really love to be able to dive into talking about the potlatch, the ceremonies. This is the very first painting of a potlatch, the oldest one we have in extant today. Talking about that as a system of governance that the Stalo people had, that it was, how complicated it was, how it tied families and tribal groups together. I would love to get into talking about family structures, a project that I'm currently working on with a colleague, Sonny McKelsey, many of you might know, and others from the Stalo Research and Resource Management Center, talking about the way that women came to live with their husbands essentially as diplomats, and how children of marriages was essentially dual citizenship in their mother and father's villages. I'd love to get into talking about the different ways that childcare took place in the past, and the ways that women related to their children, and grandmothers related to their grandchildren. I'd really like to talk about how the Halkomelem language has words that express familial relations moving back and forth through time and across generations, to the point that when you get to the 7th generation from someone living today, that is your great, 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 great grandparents, the word for that is actually the exact same as the word for your great, 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 great grandchildren, Tomyuk. And that reflects the Stalo worldview, where the people living today, as they take actions and make decisions, they're thinking about the people 7 generations in the future, accounting for their interests as best they can, but doing that in a way that would be intelligible and recognizable to people from 7 generations in the past. Oops, why is this not advancing? There we go. I'd love to talk a little bit about the fishing sites up in the Fraser Canyon that are owned by individuals. Some of these are no bigger than a small classroom in total geography, but were the most productive fishing sites and fish processing sites on the entire northwest coast of North America, and probably the entire continent. I'd love to talk about the complicated relationship that Indigenous people have with Christianity in this part of the world and elsewhere, and talk about the way that missionaries both work to undermine and support Indigenous communities, and the legacies of that within the Stalo world today. The transformation of the Stalo land base from gigantic reserves. The reserve in Masqui that covered a good part of Abbotsford, for example, was 9,600 acres. It was the largest Indian reserve in coastal British Columbia. And it was reduced 3 years after it was created down to just 90 acres, 90, from 9,600. Later on, the Masqui got it back, parts of that back, but they're still struggling to have that land restored or compensated for. I'd love to talk about all of these things, but I think it would be a bit of a disservice to some of the knowledge keepers that I've worked with in the past, who have shared with me, if I didn't direct this discussion in some way towards a broader goal. So setting a groundwork so that we can have those kind of discussions about those topics and others that I just raised with you. And for me, I think that broader goal, it has to be towards building reconciliation, to finding ways to contribute to that process where Indigenous people reacquire and reassert self-governance, and reacquire and resume meaningful control over large portions of their traditional ancestral lands, waters, and resources. That, to me, is the big glaring crisis that we face emotionally, intellectually, legally here in our country today. And so to help us get to a position, I think, where we can start to do that, where we can go, then we'd be able to go back, and maybe I'll be able to invited to come back another time and do talks on those other subjects in more detail. But to help us get to that point, I'd like to invite you tonight to reimagine the shared history between settler Canadians, people like myself of non-Indigenous ancestry, and Indigenous people. So that instead of typically seeing Indigenous people as relatively minor players in the unfolding drama of the Canadian nation state, I want you to additionally recognize the value in seeing Canada as something that unfolds within multiple Indigenous histories. That means inevitably we need to talk about colonialism. and what that means. What is it? Define it. How does it work? How do we get rid of it? Who benefits from it? Who gets hurt? So whereas many non-Indigenous Canadians think of Canada having become independent, no longer a colony, in 1867, of course, for many Indigenous people, they see themselves as still living in a state of ongoing colonization, simply because there are different types of colonization in this world. So let us define the two principal kinds of colonization that have existed and that still exist around the world. And there are subtleties to this, and there are other types, but I want to talk about two. The first one is extraction colonialism. That's the one. If you think back to your high school, and it doesn't matter if high school was last year for you or if it was like it was for me over 30 years ago now, extraction colonialism is the colonialism you learned about in high school. Extraction colonialism is the sort of thing that happened in India with the British. It happened in the Congo with the Belgians. It happened in Korea with the Japanese. And it happened in France and Poland with the Nazi Germans in the Second World War. Extraction colonialism is where people move in and they don't actually become the dominant population in terms of numbers. Rather, they move in and they reorganize the labor and the economy of that society to extract wealth from that economy back to their original homeland. So the English reconfigured the Indian economy to grow cotton. And then they took that raw cotton, brought it back to England, where it was then manufactured in the textile mills and made England an incredibly wealthy country. Right? And this is done through military control. You control people by exploiting their labor. Settler colonialism is something a little different. Settler colonialism is what we see here in Canada, in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and in several other places around the world. It's the displacement with the aim of replacing Indigenous people from their land. Settlers come here from somewhere else, and they originally recognize that they're settlers, but they don't want Indigenous labor the way they did in India or Korea, right? What they want is Indigenous land and resources. So early settlers, they value Indigenous land, not labor. The process of settler colonialism, therefore, is a structure. It's not something that you can go back and say, oh, this happened between 1939 and 1945 for France. That was when conquest colonialism, extraction colonialism took place there. It's an ongoing structure. It didn't happen just in the past because the legacies are still with us today. And it's sustained discursively. And as a historian, this is very, for me, very fascinating, because what we do is we create stories that rationalize and explain that process of settler colonialism. And the privileges of those who work and live in settler colonialism who are not Indigenous are necessarily invisible to those people who benefit from them. Settler colonialism is characterized by state-sponsored oppression and as a means of accessing land. So on the prairies, we see that process of literally clearing the plains of Indigenous people, the imposition of a pass system that prevented Indigenous people from moving around freely. Here on the Pacific coast, we see the banning of the potlatch and the winter dance, the banning of the commercial fishery on the non-tidal waters of the Fraser River, the creation of residential schools, those sorts of things. And one of the things that doesn't get talked about very much is that an aspect of settler colonialism is necessarily white privilege, white privilege. And I know that's a term that makes people bristle a little bit, but I want to get into that. It's whiteness, not being white, that is causing problems for Indigenous people in settler colonial states. Whiteness, not being white. And let me explain that. White is the way that some people might describe themselves if they have fair complexion. I might say, oh, I'm a white male. Whiteness, on the other hand, is that historical process that creates races, the idea of races, and perpetuates contemporary racism. How does it do that? It divides up the world by skin color and other physical attributes, and then ascribes characteristics and values accordingly. So the world is divided into races, and races are different. And they're different in the sense that they've been ascribed value. Some races are higher, some races are lower. That's whiteness. Whiteness does that. Sadly, The values and characteristics that we ascribe to certain races through those structures of whiteness get internalized in ways that tend to reinforce the very stereotypes that are associated with them. Structures of whiteness ascribe positive characteristics to people of British and European ancestry. They're civilized, they're rational, they're cerebral, they're industrious, and they're innovative. Structures of whiteness ascribe less positive characteristics to people of Asian ancestry. They're meek, they're inscrutable, they're obedient, they're devious. And the structures of whiteness attribute still less positive characteristics to people of African ancestry. They're athletic and physical, they're aggressive, they're emotional, they're lazy. When it comes to Indigenous people, the structures of whiteness largely ascribe characteristics of tragic nobility, cultural simplicity, spirituality, and laziness. And all of these reinforce perceptions of an Indigenous people as uncivilized, anti-innovative, and somehow locked in the past. Think of the vanishing Indian trope that comes out of that idea of whiteness, that Indigenous people are inherently incompatible with modern society and therefore will disappear. Much of British Columbia's history of the 19th century, the things that place Indigenous people on tiny reserves, put their children in residential schools, took away their land and fishing rights, was all predicated on the assumption that Indigenous people were vanishing and would be gone in 30 or 40 years in any case. There's the ecological Indian trope. There's the lazy Indian trope. There's the drunken Indian trope. And then finally, there's the white man's burden trope, the idea that we have a right to colonize people in different parts of the world based on the color of their skin, because we're actually doing them a favor. And Europeans, Canadians, British people have taken this and internalized this idea to a profound extent. And this is then used to rationalize the behavior that controls and colonizes Indigenous people on their lands. This has led to things what are essentially the informal Canadian Jim Crow laws of the past, things that weren't enforced by criminal laws, but things that Indigenous people experienced that made them know they were lesser people in the Canadian social and political hierarchy. Indigenous people weren't allowed into parks all over Canada. And up until the early 1960s, mid-1960s, many Indigenous people in the Fraser Valley were only allowed into several Chinese restaurants and not the general public restaurants that other people went to. In my hometown of Pell River, and I know in Chilliwack and Langley as well, up until the 1950s, Indigenous people weren't allowed to sit in the main portions of the theater. They had to sit up in the balcony. So we see this is all racism that spills out from these structures of whiteness. And whiteness is built upon a host of special privileges, privileges that are unearned benefits that are carried by people with light skin. And now, if you happen to be of Indigenous or of a European ancestry and you don't see those privileges in yourself right away, I want you, don't despair. Don't right away think, oh, it's not true or something's wrong with me. Because all of these white privileges, privileges of all kinds, are designed to be invisible to those who benefit from them. In fact, it's the invisibility of privilege that makes them so insidiously powerful. Invisible privileges create the false sense among those of us who have them that we don't have any white privilege at all. It makes us think that the world treats everybody equitably, regardless of their skin color. It makes us think that whatever advantage we have, we've earned through hard work. And conversely, whatever disadvantage other people have is because they haven't worked hard enough. Now, this isn't to deny that many white people have worked hard and overcome adversity to achieve what they have. Absolutely they have, right? Rather, that unlike class privilege, which is pretty easy for us to see, white privilege is invisible. It's easy to see that the children of millionaires have privileges, even if those people sometimes don't see it themselves, whether they work hard or whether they are lazy. But it's much harder for us to appreciate that those who are born with light skin have special unearned privileges too. And because privileges are designed to be invisible, having someone point them out to us can be disconcerting. It can make us feel defensive. It can be like someone's challenging the integrity of that honesty and our hard work. So we have to guard against letting ourselves have the comfort of painting ourselves as victim when people ask us to reflect upon our white privilege. Now, what's the best way to identify our white privilege? The best way is to think about those things that you don't worry about. So this is an exercise. The things we worry about, we worry about. We know what those are. It's the things we don't worry about that reveal where our privileges lie. So if you've never worried that the security guard at a store is following you up and down the aisles, well, you might have white privilege. If you've called 911, if when you call 911, you worry whether the police will treat you less urgently because of your last name or because of your street address, you might have white privilege. If when you go downtown, you dress down, you wear a hoodie and tattered jeans, and you don't worry that someone's going to think that you're a criminal or a bad person, well, you might have white privilege. If you've never worried that you might be treated poorly by a police officer during a random check, you might have white privilege. Privilege, therefore, is one of those things that proves the academic truism that I teach my students all the time. Meaning precedes experience. We can have the exact same experience, but the meaning we bring to that is shaped by who we are, by what privileges we carry. So, for example, I'm a white middle-aged man. If I have a class on campus that ends at 9 o'clock, and it's dark, it's wintertime. I know right now with COVID, we're not on campus, but imagine it's a regular world. And I walk across the parking lot to my car. I don't worry. I don't worry. But a young white woman walking across that same campus parking lot, stepping exactly where I had stepped 5 minutes earlier, who gets in her car, nothing happened to her either, the exact same experience, but she worries about being the victim of a crime. And a young Indigenous man walks across that same parking lot 5 minutes later, steps in the same places, has nothing happened to him, but he worries that he could be accused of being there to commit a crime. We've all had the same experience, but the meaning we bring to those experiences are different. Now, another important thing about settler colonialism is that it has certain logics built into how it works. And one of them is the logic of settler mobility, the right of every Canadian to move to a new place, and the right of every Canadian to move away from another place. And what this has meant in our Canadian history is that people move to places where they see economic opportunity, and then they move away if that economic opportunity disappears. They move to a place that has resources, and then if they exploit those resources, deplete those resources, or pollute those resources, they move away. There's a privilege there that they have, which is entrenched as a right in our Constitution. But if you're an Indigenous person, you're tied to a particular landscape, a particular ancestral homeland. If other people move in to see opportunities there and then destroy that homeland, destroy those resources, you simply can't take full advantage of settler colonial mobility. Now, I'm not saying that a Stala person can't move to Toronto and have a great career as a doctor or a lawyer. They absolutely can. But if every single Stala person had to move away because the Fraser Valley became a toxic place, and they all had to move to Manitoba, it would be hard for them to be Stala in that other place. You can be Canadian, whether you're in Nunavut, Alberta, or Prince Edward Island. And similarly, the settler colonial logic of democracy, that people within a jurisdiction have the right to self-determination, and the majority opinion is the rule. And we see this in Canada. In the United States, people will say that they became free, independent in 1776 when they overthrew colonial rule and became a democratic state. Now, we know that Black people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, working class men couldn't vote, and the same in Canada after 1867. But as long as Indigenous people were the majority of the territories of the United States and Canada, the Canadian government and the American government denied them the right to vote. It was only after they became a tiny minority in Canada, down to less than 2% of the population, that the right to vote and participate in Canadian politics was granted to Indigenous people, 1960. So the logic of settler democracy and the logic of settler mobility both confound Indigenous understandings of that link between their ancestral place and their identity. And we see this a lot in American Manifest Destiny and all the mythology that's wrapped up in that, or even in the name that Canada used to have up until very recently, and it's still there, the idea of Canadian dominion, that Canada has dominion from sea to sea to sea. Seen from this perspective, settlers are regarded as transcending, dominating, and controlling nature, whereas Indigenous people are regarded simply as being a part of nature. They're seen as prisoners of nature in our Canadian national histories. And this is a key point here. I'm getting near the end now for everybody. Whereas settler colonialism defines Indigenous people as problems, right? They're in the way because they block access to resources. And remember that settler colonialism is still going on, whether it was blocking if Indigenous people were blocking access to the prairies, were blocking access to the fertile farmlands of the Fraser Valley in the 1860s, or whether they're blocking access for pipeline right-of-ways today, they're seen as problems to the settler Canadian state. That's settler colonialism. Whiteness, on the other hand, defines Indigenous people as people with problems who therefore need to be fixed so that they can be integrated into the settler colonial state. So in settler colonialism, Indigenous people are a problem. In whiteness, Indigenous people are people with problems, and Canadian policies have evolved to out of both of those assumptions. Thus, the big challenge facing settler Canadians today is to find a way to transcend settler colonialism and create a respectful partnership with Indigenous people, to recognize and give up our unearned privileges, to disentangle ourselves from this nightmare of whiteness, which creates hierarchies of people based on false assumptions, to recognize the harms that have been caused Indigenous people by the way the logics of mobility and democracy have been deployed, and not merely to focus on the advantages that democracy and mobility have provided to settlers. We need to find a way to see ourselves and our history from another perspective. We need to be deeply empathetic. And we need to find a way to support Indigenous people in their struggle to reassume self-governance and meaningful control over their ancestral lands and resources. Thank you very much. Yathquith Kwasai, Masi, merci beaucoup.
Hey, Keith. Thank you. Thank you so much for that was probably the most clearly explained intro to this topic that I've actually ever experienced before. And
thank you very much.
Like, you hear a lot on this topic, but it's not always that calmly and clearly explained. So I just want to thank you for that right off the top. I would like to encourage all of those participating today to send your questions into the chat. We'll draw upon those now in the Q&A. I just wanted to start off by asking you, Keith, what is the best way that we can engage with our Indigenous neighbors and to learn more? What would that first step be?
Yeah, well, of course, the very first step is to ask your Indigenous neighbors how they would like to be supported, in what way. To be an ally, we really need to make sure that we're putting ourselves in a supporting role rather than a driving role in that relationship. But I think that, you know, what we need to do is convince our government that we support Indigenous rights. You know, Indigenous people, when the first European settlers, British settlers, moved into the Fraser Valley, the Stala people didn't say, you can only be here if you follow our customs. You need to marry my cousin. You need to integrate yourself into this bubble. They didn't do that. They were welcoming. There was cautiousness. There was some violence for a little while, but they welcomed people in. But it was our laws as British people, as Europeans, that said Indigenous people had specially protected rights because they were here first. They don't have special protected rights because of their race, because race doesn't exist. Indigenous people could be purple, they could be white. They still have Indigenous rights because they were here first. And our laws said that we're supposed to negotiate treaties with them and work out a relationship with them. And we're the ones, our ancestors, our society, our government is the one that stepped away from the obligations of our own. And what Indigenous people have been asking us to do is live up to our laws, right? So that they can exercise their governance and their control. We need to convince the government that we want to see justice done. That's what we need to do. And we need to let the government hear us. Consultations don't often happen with average Canadians on this issue. I think in part because people are afraid that Canadians won't support Indigenous rights. But I think there's a real growing swell out there of people who want to see, want the right thing to happen that should have happened generations ago, and a relationship to be built that's healthy and respectful.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's really well said. Is there any resources that you would provide for someone wanting to make their voices heard in that regard?
Well, you know, thanks for asking that. So right now, through the new Peace and Reconciliation Center at UFV, we're just starting to have conversations with the Stala Tribal Council, the Stala Nation, some of the independent bands, to create and supplement and help to coordinate an allyship building program for the entire Fraser Valley. So whether you're working for an organization who wants their employees to get training on how to be a better ally, how to understand Indigenous rights and title, or just an average citizen who says, I want to plug into that. We're working with Indigenous partners to create a system where people can do that.
Okay, perfect. We've had some interest here on what got you involved with this work. You've been doing this for a while and have been paving a lot of roads in this kind of area of research. What first motivated you to get involved here?
You know,
yeah.
well, when I was doing my master's degree back at UVic in the late 1980s, I was studying decolonization in the Philippines just because I had a passion about that subject. I was working on American sort of history in Asia. And then I applied for, and I got the very first co-op work term for a grad student at UVic. I was the guinea pig that year. And the position I got was working with the Department of Indian Affairs doing archival research on Indigenous land claims. I thought, exciting, this is wonderful. I went in, I thought I'm going to get to help Indigenous people have their land claims resolved. And what I found out is that both the Indian Affairs Department, back then Indian Northern Affairs Canada, and the Department of Justice, who was paying my co-op salary, wanted me to do everything I could in my research to thwart Indigenous claims. It was at that point that I decided I wanted to redirect my career to work on Indigenous First Nations land claims and rights. And I sent out cold resumes across the province back in the days when you had to use snail mail. And thankfully for me, the Stala Nation wrote me a letter back and said, yeah, we'll give you a shot. Come on over here. And that's how my career started.
Wow. What, out of interest, what is the average time period for land claim? Do you know that off?
Oh, it depends on whether it's a specific claim, which is a rather focused legal argument about a part of a reserve that was taken away without permission, or to the large claim, which is treaty negotiations, which you know, they haven't been resolved yet. So anywhere from a few months to a couple hundred years, I guess you could say, sadly.
Perfect. I've got a question from Caitlin here. Or how would you envision a post-colonial Canada? What would that look like?
Yeah.
Nice, easy question.
Post-colonial Canada. Well, you know, it seems we need to reimagine Canada, and every country, every society should be always reimagining itself, looking back at its traditions to find out what is good in those traditions that they want to preserve, that want to guide them as they move forward, and then looking to where they want to be to make it a better world, right? And so, again, at my very beginning of my talk, I said I'd love to come back at some other point and chat about the Stalo concept of Tomiyuk, right? Where 7 generations into the future, anybody living today is planning for that. I had elders, I had Bill, Pat, Charlie, Tilly Gutierrez, Wes Sam, Andy Commodore, Minnie Peters, and others talk about this idea. You need to plan for the future, but you need to do it in a way that is intelligible and recognizable to your ancestors. And that combines innovation with tradition, side by side, hand in hand. In Canada, we are a huge country with a few people. It would not tear our country apart if, instead of Indigenous people being impoverished people who struggle on tiny marginal bits of land, if they were wealthy people who, alongside other settlers of all races, benefit from the land that is in this massive country. That to me seems like it shouldn't be that hard to figure out. We would be a good country if Indigenous people were as wealthy or wealthier than the average settler. As long as they're less wealthy, as long as they overpopulate the prisons, then there's something sick. And I mean that in a healthcare system way. There's something sick about the body politic in Canada that allows that to go on as if that isn't a crisis that we need to address.
This is a question somewhat related to that. Can you share with us, this is from Allison, can you share with us some of the best ways you have seen companies or individuals build in reconciliation into their organization or personally into their goals as a personal organization?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's about educating ourselves, right? It's about educating ourselves about the Indigenous people upon whose lands we're living. Who are they? How do we respect them? How do we support them? How do we become good neighbors? You know, Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, now Senator, said, you know, you can boil down reconciliation to the basic idea of friendship. You want Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people to become actual friends where you care about each other and you look after each other's interests, right? So what does that mean for the average person in an organization or an individual living? Well, you know, learn about Indigenous people and don't put extra burden on them as you do that learning too, right? It's not like you need to, Indigenous people shouldn't feel that they need to answer every knock on every door to help every settler come in and say, hey, I want to learn about you. There are resources online, there are books, there are places you can educate yourself, great courses being offered at universities in our province. And then once you have that and you're learning that new information, that new kind of content, do that synchronously with understanding and self-reflection about the type of privilege that you carry. We all have privilege, right? Whether we're white people or not, whether we're male or not, whether we're heterosexual or not, we carry certain privileges that we think are normal. And we need to critically reflect on those.
Would it be okay to ask if we could tap you on the shoulder after this for a couple of recommended resources that we could maybe email out to those who've been able to make it today?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to do that, but and also to recommend you to some of my colleagues and other people who are out there who are, you know, making a career and or generously offering their time to do this kind of thing. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I've got a question from Marianne here. Different governments have been hard at work engaging in land claim dialogues over the last 40 years. Do you see that progress is being made there?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Progress is being made. But you know, when you're no Indigenous people in the province have been as impacted as the Coast Salish by settler colonialism, because you've got over 3 million people living just here in the Lower Mainland Fraser Valley, right? All cramped into this one space. And those people want more and more roads. They want more and more resources. So more and more busy railroads, more and more busy pipelines. And these cumulative effects continue to just weigh heavier and heavier and heavier on the Stala people and on the resources of their territories. So this is a heavy, heavy burden that Indigenous people bear, and some Indigenous communities shoulder that burden even more than others. So has there been progress? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Things are way better than they were in 1990, but at the same time, there are less resources than there were back in 1990 because we've continued to gobble up space, land, forests, minerals, water. So while there's progress on one hand, what's left for Indigenous people becomes compromised and smaller with each passing year.
Perfect. I had the pleasure of actually having a conversation with Keith before this, before the event started, and he previously was in the Valley, but he spent a lot of time across Canada. And his first comment was saying that when he came back, it felt more crowded, and he didn't think back then that the commutes could get any worse. So, I've got a question here for you from Maddie. She's asking a question on reconciliation and treaties. Specifically, what are your thoughts on the phrase, "we are all treaty people," especially in the context of BC, which is largely entreated?
Yeah.
How does reconciliation fit into this context?
Yeah. I look forward to the point where we can say that we are all treaty people. This is something that the First Nations on the prairies have done a very good job with educating, getting this message and curriculum into the public school systems and elsewhere, saying that it's not just Indigenous people who got treaties, who got land and an annual annuity payment and the right to hunt and fish in some way, that everybody who moved into that territory that used to be exclusively theirs benefits because the treaty enables them to have their property, their private land in Saskatoon, Regina, Edmonton, wherever that might be. In British Columbia, we're not at the point yet where negotiated treaties, agreements, whatever they might look like. They might not even be called treaties. We could have different names for them. But only in a few places within this province have Indigenous people been able to successfully define their relationship with the Canadian government and with the Canadian society. So yeah, if you're in the Niska territory or the Tla'amin territory or the Tawasin territory, you can say, if you live there, that you're a treaty person because you benefit because that Indigenous community has allowed you now to be there too. So if you go hunting, if you go fishing, if you go shopping at the mall, you're exercising a treaty right as a settler in those territories. But if you're doing that in Abbotsford or Chilliwack or Lytton, no, you can't make that claim because your government hasn't gone in to represent you well enough to negotiate a deal with the Indigenous people who live there.
Yeah, I've got a question from Byron here. Do you think settlers can heal their settlerism when they're so far removed from their own land?
Yeah. You know, I'm actually working on an article right now that I'm calling the conundrum of double permanence. Indigenous people and settlers are both here to stay today. But if you had asked Indigenous people or settler people back in the Fraser Valley in 1860 and 1864, if they thought that themselves or the other side of that equation would be here in 200 years, you wouldn't have got that answer. Most settlers back then assumed Indigenous people would disappear within 30 to 40 years. That was well established. And a lot of Indigenous people thought, these people can't just stay here forever. They got to leave after a while, right? And so we got off in a relationship where both, to a certain extent, but much more on the settler side, assumed that the other wouldn't be here. And so that we wouldn't have to live with the consequences of not becoming friends, of not forming partnerships. Well, Indigenous people, much to their credit, and despite all kinds of pressures upon them from outside, survived. They survived residential school, they survived smallpox, they survived tuberculosis. And suddenly by the 1930s, instead of their population declining, it starts to increase, right? And it's been growing ever since. We as a Canadian society, our leaders made decisions based on the idea that they wouldn't be here. So now we have to live with that and we have to fix that. So there's a conundrum there. There's a challenge. There's a riddle that we have to find an answer to. Is it going to be the people my generation who are going to figure that out? I don't know. I don't think so. But you know, I look at the young people that I meet at university, the kids I see going to K-12 schools. I look at the energy, the empathy that I see in those communities, and I'm kind of filled with hope. I think we can do it. You know, we just have to make sure that we keep it as a priority.
Speaking of the younger generation, there's quite a few students that have been chiming through. A lot of them have been asking for your advice on ways to get involved with Indigenous research, policy making, or to support the local Indigenous community. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure. Well, you know, again, don't go just lumbering in. Learn a little bit. Do your homework before you go in and start offering your assistance. But once you have done your homework, once you have familiarized yourself with the Stalo people and the local communities around you, well, then make overtures, respectful ones, and take the classes that are offered right now. Boy, there's courses on Indigenous topics being offered by Indigenous scholars in criminology, Indigenous studies, English. They're all over the campus. There are people who are there providing another generation with a lot of the tools that they need to transcend those problems that my generation hasn't been able to solve.
Right now, you mentioned that there's been some steps done towards reconciliation. What would you say the most innovative or exciting things that are happening right now on a governmental level towards this that you think?
Yeah, on the governmental level, the government's behind. there's way more goodwill and good actions happening outside of government, it seems to me. But that's not to say that there aren't some people in government, both in elected positions and in salaried positions, bureaucrat positions, who are firmly dedicated to moving towards genuine reconciliation. That exists, and those people, they need to be pat on the back and given credit for fighting against a big bureaucracy that is set up to preserve and reinforce itself. So yeah, there's movement happening within the government. I think, provincially, we see in fits and starts, the same way we see it with the federal government, really good ideas that come out, and it looks like there's going to be a lot of momentum. And then special interest groups start to bang and hammer at those ideas from the sides, and governments ease off too much, because I don't think they know just how much the average Canadian wants to see this resolved in a respectful way. And then someone else comes along after working with Indigenous communities to develop ideas and policies, and they'll promote those, and then special interest groups hammer those from the sides. And, so it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it's moving in the right direction.
Perfect. On the more hopeful side, what is one of the things you're researching or seeing in research right now that gets you most excited?
I get excited by almost anything historical. So there's in the Stalo world, in Halkomelin language, there are people who are at the very top, right, the elite, and they're called Smalath. And I remember talking to Edna Bob, was the first elder I talked to about this, and I asked her, what does that mean, Smalath? And she said, well, they're worthy people. Those are worthy people. Okay, and then below them, there was a smaller group of people. It's sort of an inverted European triangle with, Europe has the elite at the top, a small number, and a huge number of peasants and then the Stalo one is the other way around. So at the top, there's a large number of Smalath. Beneath them were these people who were called Stechem. And I asked Edna Bob, what does that mean? And she said, Stechem. She goes, that means worthless people. Oh, worthless people, okay. Well, what makes someone worthy? She says, well, they know their history. And I said, well, okay, and Stechem? Well, those are people who have lost or forgotten their history. And I thought, as a historian, I thought, wow, what is this utopia where people value historians above all, above all other trades and professions? But what she was talking about, of course, is that to be worthy is to know your family history, so you know where you're allowed to harvest, to fish, to hunt, who your relatives are to turn to when you need assistance. And people who don't know that, who have either forgotten it or lost it in some way, those people find themselves in a worthless situation where they are struggling to just feed themselves, let alone have the supports around them. So when I do my research, what I do is I talk to people in communities, and as they suggest ideas, we co-design research projects, and then we go forward to execute those research projects. And one of the ones I'm working on right now, again with Sunny McKelsey, I mentioned at the beginning, and others, came out of a suggestion by 2 elders at the Suwali First Nation back about 6 years ago. And so what we're studying now, we've completed most of the research. We're now in the sort of analysis side of it, is looking at the impacts that settler colonialism had on Stalo Coast Salish families in the late 19th century, and how that has impacted the ability of Coast Salish communities to cooperate and collaborate today. And it's a really fascinating social cultural history that came out of a conversation with 2 wonderful little old ladies over a cup of tea.
That is fascinating, and also a really beautiful aspect. And I see why somebody who's part historian would be so excited about that area. Just want to remind the audience that this is such a intro level to these different topics, and we'd really encourage you to explore more. There's only so much we can explore in an hour. I'm really interested in going into further detail on some of the other topics, like how do you have dual citizenship in the same village, and some of those other aspects. So I guess we'll have to invite Keith back soon. But I'm just going to end our Q&A portion here today. And thank you again, Keith, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure and very, very interesting. I feel like I'm walking away a smarter person. And again, this recording will be available to everybody afterwards. This will be emailed to you, and we'll ask Keith if there's any resources that he can recommend to us to include in that. So thank you again, Keith. Just in closing up today, I'd like to